Hi, y'all. Y'all, I'm not from the South. I'm from a desert, which is worse than the South. Although I don't really like sweating all the time. Like I got out of the plane. I had 7 job offers in Dallas, Texas. And I got off the plane. I said, nope, I'm not going to say yes to any of them. Because that whole sweating constantly from humidity is not for me. I live in a dry heat. Well, that's not true, because in July in Tucson, Arizona, we get some serious humidity. And I have a swamp cooler, 1952 house, and so it has a swamp cooler. So it's pretty swampy. But it's a lot better than what I was experiencing. So this is spontaneous. I'm just allowing the Holy Spirit to guide me. I rely on Him. Try not to hit my thing. Woo! Let me turn some fan action on here. It is a little swampy. You know, the sun came out and we got clouds coming in, so hey, thanks for hanging out there. We are on the least among you. You know, this is something said all over the place in the Old Testament and the New. Jesus really played off of it because he knew the prophecies very well, obviously, of the Old Testament about the least among you. And so he kept talking about this, and we'll see this. See, God reverses the hierarchal structure of who really knows him. Go look at the knowledge page. And he just completely turns this upside down, because in the Old Testament, we see the emphasis from the greatest to the least. We see that phrase all the time. But the New Covenant is from the least to the greatest. So Jesus is always talking about this. Oh, so we'll see this. As we see in the introduction, right, in the introduction for least among us, in Jeremiah 31:34, and you say, what introduction? Well, if you got to this blog, you got to it from the main page, and that is this page right here. So I'll put a link to it, so you could just say, oh, wow, maybe it came in from some other direction, right? It's possible. I don't know how you found this. Maybe you just found it on YouTube. But you want to follow the page link, because it has all the details. I've just collected this for many, many years, and I'm putting it all in one place so that you can get the whole counsel of God. You can look everything up and really study it for yourself. And you can really pray about it. That's the main thing. God says the radical difference, right? There's a radical difference of the completely different in kind. So I'm adding things because the Lord's just guiding me right now. He says it needs to be, right? It's coming into my mind. I trust that. Completely different in kind, new covenant. Go look at that page. Over the old covenant, it's completely different. Is that, quote, now this is what God says in Jeremiah 31:34, my people shall actually all, right, all, mentally see, to perceive, or know me. Now that's really important, because this is internal vision. This is prophetic vision. It is not just Moses, who is the only one who actually saw God face to face. He's the only one. And there's verses for all these, so you can go look at that. Furthermore, God emphasizes in the grammar and sentence structure that the hierarchy of knowledge dissemination will be reversed from the least of them to the greatest, right? From the least to the greatest. Go look at how many times it says from the greatest to the least. This is the Old Testament. This is a standard idiom for what was going on, this hierarchy of knowledge dissemination, right, by teachers. It's completely reversed. Now, there is no teaching. We'll find that out probably in the next part. There is no teaching involved. None at all. But it's mental seeing them, seeing God, mentally perceiving to see them. And so we have this, all the Greek, right, or Hebrew if it's involved, is in the notes. So I'm not going to go into it unless the Lord tells me to. This reversal of hierarchy of importance, right, is a precursor of the millennial kingdom that Isaiah 60, 2-22 describes for a redeemed Israel after, quote, a darkness shall cover the earth. But Yahweh, now this is the millennial kingdom. There is a darkness, the Lord's told me this. Go look at God messages. Wow, there is a darkness that shall cover the earth. But then there's going to be, but Yahweh shall rise upon you, and nations shall come to your light. What's going to happen? The great revival to your light, and to what's happening in Israel when the Lord does this. The wealth of the nation shall come to you. Yes, they will shower Israel for the name of Yahweh your God, and coupled to this, for the Holy One of Israel. So the Holy One of Israel is the Messiah. It's Jesus. Yeshua is the name in Hebrew, meaning I am your salvation. And so this is a prophecy about Jesus coming. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. This is what's coming. And a lot of people have seen it. Go look at my God messages. For the nation and kingdom will not serve you. Oh, for the nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. They shall perish. And be utterly laid to waste. Yep, that's coming. The Lion of Judah is coming to lay to waste those nations that came against Israel. I will make the place of my feet glorious, because he puts his feet down on the Mount of Olives and splits it right open. And that's right there in Israel, right there by Jerusalem. And you shall know that I, Yahweh, am your Savior. That's what Yeshua means. And your Redeemer. Jesus is the Redeemer. Yeshua. Jesus is just Greek. Iesus is the Greek. You know, the Germans called it Jesus, and it kind of stuck with English-speaking people. And he says, the sun and the moon shall not be your light, right? So there's going to be a change in the way we get our light. But Yahweh will be your everlasting light. The least one, he says, shall become a clan, and the smallest one a mighty nation. There's a lot of words here that you can look at as to what they mean. And so the least is like small, nothing to it, and like you can just overlook it very easily. And so you want to, and he says, let's see what else he says. I am Yahweh, so in its time, so it's not time yet, but in its time, he will hasten it. I will hasten it. Once again, we see an allusion or reference to the everlasting new covenant. So this is what it's talking about. And Christ's return. At the end of it. So there's two things going here. The beginning of the new covenant and then the church age, which is in the new covenant, and then the end of it by this Christ return. So there's a lot of good, this second coming of Christ after the Battle of Armageddon, and there's all these words, these Greek words and Hebrew words, and you want to look at those about the least insignificant, the young, the small, and then it talks about these mighty shall become a clan, vast, numerous, great, and so we're going to see some amazing things happen here. So you want to look at all these references, right? Jesus' teaching ties right into these Old Testament references, even using the same words. Of course, he's a rabbi, and he wrote these things. He spoke these things, I should say. He never wrote anything. He spoke these things to the prophets. He teaches, for he who is micros, least among you, all is the one who is actually great. So he just reverses it. He's saying, I know you think these are micros, but they're actually megas, right? Where we get mega. See how he just turns it, micro, megas? But just who are the least among you? Well, he was referring to people in his group, so we could just look at context. Well, the Greek word gar stands for four, links the phrase back to the previous situation. Again, just read verses in context. I have a couple of you guys that text me or put comments down on these videos. You're not wanting to read things in context. You want to take verses out of context. That's called eisegesis. It's not exegesis. It violates every rule of biblical interpretation. You never take verses out of context. You always look at everything an author says, and because we're not just following Paul's vision, we're following Peter's and John's, we should be looking at the entire New Testament. And we should look at everything that is said on a subject, not just one person's view on that subject, and you really should understand that one person's view on a subject by reading everything he said on that subject, certainly in the letter. So, because the people who got that letter are going to say, well, what does he mean by this? And they're just look at what he said. But you could also say, well, Paul's not going all over the map. He's preaching the same thing over and over and over to all these churches. So you can go look at all these other writings, So it's called, that's called hermeneutics, biblical interpretation. So stay within the author, stay within the book, context of the book, stay within the context of the author, and then compare it to how, other authors refer to it, or how Jesus refers to it. And he says, he links this back to a previous situation. And, quote, an argument arose among them, and that is his disciples, as to which of them was greater, Mizon. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a hold of a paidion, which is a young child. Now, this is a child younger than 7 to 8, thus still under training, all right? So it's a specific child, and it's probably likely before reading age. So they went to school, so sometimes it's clear that it's young. By knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a hold of a paidion young child, where we get podiatry, and stood him upright by his side. Now, it just means to place. So the fact that he had to stand him tells you that he was very young, for Jesus had to hold him up, right, to stand by his side. So this is likely a very young child. Whoever receives or welcomes, the same word, dekamai, warmly welcomes, this paidion young child, there's that word again, in my name receives or welcomes me. So they were arguing about who was going to be great, and he's like, oh, but there you go. That's who's going to be great. Clearly, the least among you included very young children that most people thought of as insignificant, right? But Jesus exalts them to megas greatness. So the Lord really showed me this because it's part of the new covenant, right? In parallel or a different situation, occasion of Matthew 18, it could be in parallel or possibly a different. When his disciples asked about who is the greater in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus calls to himself a paideia young child, putting him in the midst or middle of them, and said, truly I say to you, unless you change direction and become like this young child, but the paideia young children, you will not in possibility or in fact. Now that's really strong language. Enter, that's a double negative. Enter the kingdom of heaven. So, you can look at exactly what is said in Bible Hub, as you've seen me do many times. So you can just go in there, hit interlinear, and you can see he set this person into place. And it's still that same word of histemi, which means to set into place. Histemi. So it is really using the exact same words. Wow. He set him into place. So I don't like that word putting, because it really means to stand or set. In the midst or middle of them. So right in the middle of the crowd. So it sounds to me like the same story, right? So I'm just setting this up for you so you can see this in set or stood. So that's what it means. And again, it's this very young child. And he said he stood him in the middle of them. And he says, he stood him in the middle and he says, I say to you, if you do not turn, that means to be converted and become as little as these little children. So now he's using the plural, these little children. So it's plural. So he's using this little person as pointing probably to other children. So we miss a lot of body language. He's probably pointing to the other children. He says, unless you become like these little children, because this little child was probably with other little children. He says, you will not in possibility or in fact, enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever lowers himself like, it says, whoever lowers themselves like, now he goes back to the singular, because he's talking about the little kid that's right in front of him, because it's singular. Whoever does this is greater in the kingdom of heaven. So it's this humbling or lowering oneself. So we really should watch little kids and learn from them. That's what I learned about this. He says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, micros, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Little children are humble or lowly. They are. To whom God, right, they're lowly, to whom God gives grace, What is grace? To rather than the high and mighty proud that God opposes. What is grace? Grace is defined, charis, as unconditional, loving favor. That's what it's defined as. So there's a link for this, and that is in a verse in James 4:6 and 1 Peter 5:5. Which group will we emulate? What are we going to be like? You know, the little kid who's humble and lowly, they're teachable, right? There's a lot of other things we'll find out about little children that we need to be like. In a similar Mark 9:34-37 passage, there's a similar passage, could be all the same instant. Jesus squares away the 12 apostles who were arguing about who the greatest would be, right? Who were the greatest? That's what he's like. Hey, they were arguing who were the greatest, right? Saying if anyone would be first, where we go first, they must be last. Last of all. Wow. Of all the other people, they must be last of all. And having taken a young child, here we go, Padian young child, and having embraced him in his arms, he held him close. He stood him upright. This is another word. Stood him upright in the midst or middle of them, and said to them, whoever receives or welcomes one such young child in my name receives or welcomes me. So let's go look at Mark 9:34, and let's see where he talks about this. Let's look at this. Takes a little child, taking in arms, he said, and he put in, set, there's that word, histemi. He set, or there it is, the same word, histemi, which means set or placed. Histemi. So we get some words about how Paul put into place various elders at all the different churches that he went to. And that word there is histemi. So whoever, he says, and having taken, he stood him upright. That's that histemi. He stood him, he set him in, it just doesn't say upright. See, the English Bibles are adding stuff. They're adding stuff. We just see there's no upright. He says he set or placed or, set or stood, right? It in the midst of them. Third person's it, this child, right? Stood it in the midst of them. So there it is. You got to read from the Greek, you know. It makes a difference. So don't read from English Bibles. There's 900 of them. They're all different. And he said, in the midst of them, and he said, you'll be last, right? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Society considered Padian young children as eschatos, where we get eschatology, the last things, the end of days, Revelation. He says they considered them last, but Jesus made them firsts. I love it. He just shocked people, didn't he? Later in Matthew 19 and Mark 10, Padian young children were brought to Jesus to lay hands on and pray for them. But the disciples rebuked the people for this. Jesus was indignant and told them to not only let them come, but not to hinder them. For the kingdom belongs to such as these. In Matthew's account, the disciples witness an important rich young ruler, right, fail to enter the kingdom. Certainly society viewed them as firsts. Absolutely. But Jesus remarked in Matthew 19:30, many who are firsts shall actually be lasts, and the lasts first. Jesus is turning the tables on who we view as important. But why? Well, we saw that being lowly or humble has something to do with it. And little children, right, the little children have powerful angels watching out over them. So we have some clues. So let's pull on this thread some more. Jesus also applied this saying in Matthew 20:16 to those who only served him for a short while, receiving the same reward as those who served him for a long while, for much longer. Although the Jews were protos, first to serve God, and the Gentiles, eschatos, last, right? Here it is, last. The Gentiles came in after the fact. Many Gentiles will have entered the kingdom ahead of many of the Jews. Although Paul says in Romans 11:25 that this partial hardening of their hearts, right, due to unbelief, he said they're hardened heart because their unbelief has come upon Israel only until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Then all of Israel shall be saved. In Luke 13:30, Jesus applied this saying to those who will come from all over the world into the kingdom. That is, Gentiles that the Jews considered lasts. Wow, you see that? They considered the Gentiles are losers. They're last. They wouldn't even eat with them. Compared to themselves as they thought were protos firsts, right? They were first, the first that God reached out to. He said this while journeying toward Jerusalem. Replying to someone who asked if only a few would be saved. It was Paul. During that time, the Essenes believed that only a few Jews would be saved, right? The Essenes of Qumran. Also, I'm sure that many Pharisees, this was Jesus, right? Jesus said this, the first shall be last. While journeying towards Jerusalem, replying to someone who asked if only a few would be saved. During that time, the Essenes believed that only a few Jews would be saved. Also, I'm sure that many Pharisees believed they were the handpicked. Nobody even considered the Gentiles. That's right. Jesus said that the way or door was narrow, and many will seek to enter after the door is closed, and thus won't be able to. These were the Jews who rejected Christ's preaching in their own streets. He even said to some, it's going to be better on the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah. With all their sin, it'll be better for them than it will be for you. These cities that rejected Jesus, wow, they just rejected Jesus. The Jews just, wow, said, boy, wait till you see what's coming. The proud Jews thought they were the workers of God, but Jesus called them workers of evil, to be cast out in the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, only because they rejected him. Jesus said he was the only way to the Father, the only way to the Father, and the only door for his sheep. Judgment Day is going to be a real shock to a lot of people. So now we see a list of who is in the least among you. That consists of, what do we see? It consists of little children, right? And Gentiles. So we see this, that we know who's in this, little children and Gentiles. But the lasts, eschatos, lasts, were also, we find, servants, bondservants, and slaves. Jesus caught his disciples more than once arguing about who was the meson greatest. We saw this already. In Mark 9:34-37, Jesus said to them, if anyone would be protos first, we saw this, he must be last of all and coupled servant of all. Here Jesus is directly coupling last of all and servant of all. You see, he's saying, I'll tell you who the last are. They're the servants. You must be like them. The servants didn't belong to the family, business, or office, right? The workplace, but were truly on or near the bottom of the stack. All right? They weren't part of the family or business, but were truly, so they had servants, they had people working for them, but were truly on or near the bottom of the stack. But Jesus goes further, as we already spoke of, having taken a Padian young child and having embraced him in his arms, he stood him upright in the midst or middle of them and said to them, so this is Mark, we already saw this, he set or placed stood it, right? And that says histemi. Where is that word, histemi? Where, oh, where is the histemi? There it is, the histemi. So there it is, histemi. Set or stood in the midst or middle of them and said, whoever receives or welcomes one such young child in my name or authority, same, that's what it means, we know welcomes me. We know from Galatians 4:1 that according to Jewish tradition, an heir, as long as he is a nepios, breastfeeding infant, that's another Greek word, breastfeeding infant, this is very young, is nothing different from a slave, even though he is the kurios, owner of everything. So when they're young, they're going to be the owner of the business, right? Once they get their inheritance, they're going to be the owner. And he says here, clearly, Jesus is directly linking nepios, breastfeeding infants, and Padian young children, right? He's directly including them into the category, the lasts of all. And to the servants of all. And even to slaves, whether willing bond slaves or not. So he doesn't really say, but he's saying, hey man, last of all, servants, slaves, there are even these breastfeeding infants. And now the list of least among you is even bigger. So there's a lot that he's included in this list. Servants, slaves, little children, infants. This is the last place the dissemination of the knowledge of God under the old covenant ever got to, if it did at all. If it did at all. Question whether the slaves, the Gentile slaves, they probably didn't even bother for a business or home. I bet you they didn't read the scriptures at all to them. So we're about halfway through. So let's go on to part 2. Part 2 video. So I'd be interested so far to see what you guys have experienced yourself about little children and what we just read, and your experiences Bible verses, what the Lord's told you, what you've seen at church, so that we can all learn about this together. All right, that's what this body ministry, go look at body ministry, is all about, right? But now we're on the least among us, right? Among the body. So let's see what's going on in part 2. All right, bye-bye. Put your comments down below and on the page.